Welcome to the Westport Library. Today's program will begin momentarily. Supported by Verso Studios, created locally and shared with the world.
Good afternoon. If everybody could start taking their seats, please. Good afternoon and welcome to the 5-star Westport Library in the extraordinary Trevs Forum. Thank you for joining us today for what should be a really productive community discussion. Many thanks to the library staff for helping pull this together, in particular Alex Giannini, who is, anybody who's worked with him know, an extraordinary master of production. I'm Kristen Mott-Purcell. I represent District 1 on the RTM. I'm also a business owner in Saugatuck. Some time ago, I was introduced to the, at that point, nascent Connecticut Municipal Development Association called MURDA. Thank goodness we had a name change. In learning about the state quasi-program, I became convinced that this was a conversation we should have as a community here in Westport. To that point, I'm thrilled that you are joining us for what should be a dynamic and thoughtful conversation about our community in general and Saugatuck specifically. Joining us are David Kooris, Executive Director of the Connecticut Municipal Development Association, and Dave Briggs, a well-known Westporter and member of the Board of Trustees for the library. I will leave each of them to introduce themselves. Quick notes about process. David and Dave are going to have a conversation and a small presentation about the CMDA. Following that, we will enter into Q&A. There are note cards on the back table. If you would write your questions out on the note card, I'd be happy to grab them and make sure that Dave has them for discussion. We encourage your questions and participation. With that, unless there are any additional questions, I'm happy to bring on Mr. Westporter, Dave Briggs, and David Kooris.
Thank you, my friend. Good to see you, Ian. How you doing, buddy? Thanks, guys, for being here. Two things. This is all about you, so we want those questions, so please fill out the note cards. That's how we're going to take the questions. We're not going to use the mic today. And the other one is, I know people want to hear about the Hamlet, why it didn't work, why it might work. We're not here to address the past. David is here to address the future, how we get it right, how the process should work the next time we go about this, and he has some examples of how it's always worked in other parts of this state. So we want this conversation to be about you and about what David's plan is via the CMDA. He has spent more than a decade at Yale as a lecturer in both environment and architecture, and he'll tell you a little bit about his fascinating journey around the planet as he's learned about development situations like this. David Kooris, come on up, great to have you, and we'll get right to the chairs and get right to your presentation.
Hear me okay? Oh, yeah, there we go. Thank you very much, Dave, and thank you, Kristen, for not just introducing, but hosting, and thanks to the library. I do want to say at the outset, you get a lot of credit for the way in which you're starting the conversation about this process here in town. I crisscross the state every week. I present to affordable housing commissions and economic development committees and boards of representatives or RTMs and city councils, but this is the first community where the dialogue has started with a public forum, and so I think that's a really great.
I wouldn't give us too much credit. I think if we had you here about a year and a half ago, we'd be in a better place. So we appreciate that.
Cheers. So I'm going to talk a bit about the Municipal Development Authority and how we work and what we are. Fundamentally, it is a quasi-public authority, which means it's a creature of the state, but it's not the state. I do not work for the state of Connecticut. I work for the Municipal Development Authority, which was established in state statute. And I'll go into more information about exactly what that means. And we say that we are CMDA. Our website is wearecmda.org, and we're very passionate about that sort of nomenclature because it really does represent the partnership that we try and create with our member municipalities and with our consultants and with our state agencies. We're all working together to try and create the types of communities in Connecticut that we think best position us for a prosperous, equitable, and sustainable future. But before I talk about that, I'm gonna tell you a little bit about myself, and I'm gonna get maybe a little bit more personal than I usually do, because I think it's important for you to understand sort of how I approach community development and how I came to be in the position that I'm in, not just in this organization, but working in planning throughout the state of Connecticut. So I've got a 20-plus year career working in urban, suburban, and regional planning, and I'm very deliberate about that explanation because I've worked in communities of all different types all over the world. I've worked for the civic sector, for think tanks and nonprofits. I've worked as a consultant for agencies and property owners. I've worked in the public sector at state and local government, and I've worked in academia, as Dave mentioned, as a lecturer at Yale for about 13 years. I've held local elected office. I was on the Board of Representatives in Stamford, which is kind of the equivalent to the RTM. So I understand what it means to represent a localized kind of neighborhood. And I was also on the Board of Finance in Stamford. And so I understand what it means to be thinking about the fiscal conditions and sustainability of a community and a municipality. I've worked at a variety of different scales: neighborhood, municipal, regional. I've done national plans for countries abroad. So everything from a couple blocks up to an entire country. I grew up in Fairfield. I lived there for my first 18 years. I've spent a lot of time in Westport. Traveled around quite a bit, as I'll describe in a moment. And then I've lived in Stamford now for about 18 years. So almost just now, I think, more than the time I spent in Fairfield. So it's the longest I've ever been in one place. But I intimately know southwestern Connecticut and sort of, the Westport area in particular. This is not the exact house that I grew up in, but it's almost an identical house about a block over. Cape Cod, on slab, tract housing, in a part of Fairfield that was, pig farms and horse farms, that was developed in the 1950s, which created the opportunity for my grandparents who worked in Bridgeport to get a suburban house. And then my parents actually bought a very similar, pretty much identical house just a block away from my parents in the same neighborhood that my mom grew up in. And I raise that because I think it's important to think about the relationship between development and opportunity. My parents would not be able to probably buy the house that they have now or that they bought decades ago. Being in the same neighborhood, multi-generations, is a rarity and a challenge, but that was an opportunity that was available to us. But it wasn't a walkable neighborhood. There were no sidewalks. The houses were very small. When I was 10 years old, this is the actual house I grew up in, we added a second story on the house and converted it from a cape to a colonial. And I mention this because it shows the way in which, buildings are adaptable and change over time to meet the changing household needs. But this was also the moment at which when I learned about architecture and design and became incredibly fascinated by it, working with the architects around the table with my parents. And I ended up getting the opportunity. I went to Fairfield High when it was one high school when I was there. And we had architecture. That was actually an offering. And I took architecture for 4 years at Fairfield High. And so my grounding was in kind of architectural design. But I elected not to go into architecture in university. I went to school in Montreal. These are the 3 different apartment buildings and townhouses that I lived in Montreal. And when I was there, I studied archaeology. That was where I began my university career. And I mention that because it taught me some of the biggest lessons that have kind of been consistent throughout my career. I was studying, ancient Egypt and the Harappan civilization in Pakistan and all these ancient cultures, and trying to understand the relationship between built form and past societies. And ultimately, I learned about environmental determinism and the fact that we, as individuals and as societies, are enabled or constrained by the environment around us, right? A society is going to grow up very different in the Andes than it is in the plains versus on a coastal, estuary. And ultimately, I came to the realization, working with my professors, that we now create almost the entirety of our environment. We create the environment within which our societies are then enabled or constrained. And I discovered urban planning and the idea that through infrastructure and development and the layout of our settlements, we could enable future society to be the best version of itself, and ultimately combined the background in architecture and archaeology and my newfound interest in urban planning to what became my ultimate career in community development. I'm going to show you some of the other places I lived, and it tells a little bit of a story. These are the 2 different apartments I lived in Montreal, in Sydney, a big former department store converted into housing, a small kind of condo by the beach in Coogee. This is the apartment building I lived in Vancouver. Beautiful tree-lined street, multifamily housing, but across the street from multi-million-dollar single-family homes. These are the apartments I lived in Philadelphia when I was in grad school, one of the taller towers in downtown, a former duplex converted to multi-bedroom student housing, and then ultimately the places I lived in New York City and Brooklyn. And I share these just to show, depending on the place that I lived, my lifestyle was very different. Did I live within walking distance of the beach? Then I was exercising a lot more. Did I live within walking distance of restaurants and bars? I was going out a lot more. Was able to walk to class or office, or did I have to take a bus, or did I have to drive? What was my commute like? The conditions within which I lived, the neighborhood and the housing typology, then drove my lifestyle. It drove the way that I was able to behave. We moved back to Connecticut, as I said, about 18 years ago now. We moved to Stamford. My wife and I bought a condo in downtown Stamford, and we picked a neighborhood where we didn't have to buy the second car, right? That was the primary objective, was where can we live, where we can have some room to grow, we don't have to get the second car, we can walk for some of our trips. We needed to be close enough to the train because we were still going into Manhattan somewhat regularly, or my wife every day. And we were there until we had our second kid and ran out of room. And now we're back in a single family house, just like where I grew up, probably bigger than I ever would have expected, and a house that I could never afford today, but was lucky enough to get prior to the upsurge in demand that we've seen post-COVID. And so, we know that there's a chain, there's a life cycle, right? The housing that you need when you're single is very different than the housing that you need when you're married, very different than when you have kids. Maybe then there's an opportunity to downsize. We go through this change. And when we think about what we build today, we need to be conscious of, what our society looks like, not just today, but what it will look like in the future. And the development that we build, it lasts a long time. I mean, we don't think about it all that much. We're thinking about what happens over the coming years. We rarely even think about what's going to happen over the term of a 30-year mortgage, let alone beyond that. But the buildings that we build today are almost certainly going to be here in 2050. Many of them will probably be here in 2100. The oldest building in Westport, and I don't know if this is exactly it, but it's about 325 years old, I think, the oldest house. Might there be a building that we build today that's still here in 2350? Perhaps. And we have no idea exactly what the future is going to hold. But there is a process that we can go through to best prepare our community for that uncertainty and to try and make decisions today that create the greatest possible benefits and the least possible negative externalities. So a few principles that I would share from my time working with communities large and small across Connecticut and beyond. The first, by far, is participatory process. It is absolutely imperative to meaningfully engage the entire cross-section of the community in a discussion about what you want to be when you grow up. And I have found, certainly there is no substitute for face-to-face interaction. I I think, Zoom and digital and all the various opportunities that we have for us today are great in that they can supplement direct stakeholder engagement and can provide an opportunity for people to participate where they might not have otherwise been able to. But in my own experience, having people sit around the table together that come from different backgrounds and have different interests, the bike and pedestrian advocate, the affordable housing advocate, the longtime homeowner whose kids are still in school, the industrial business owner, the preservationist, right? Having those people from the community talk with one another about their common interests, the ways in which they might diverge, and try and work together on a shared solution for the future of their community is irreplaceable. And I've found time and time again that when curated properly, that having those voices together will come to the right decision 100% of the time for their community. The trick is always, how do you represent the folks who aren't in the room? And that could be making sure that you get folks who don't typically participate to come to the table, but also, who speaks for the people who don't live in the community today? Who speaks for the kids who are future residents of the community? And try as hard as we can to have, workshops with students and young people to bring all those different voices into the process. The second overarching principle I would share is, there is tremendous uncertainty, and there's a big move in the planning sector today around scenario planning. It's very common in business. It's just becoming finally a little bit more common in government. But the future can play out in a lot of different ways. The important part of the process is making sure you have the best information available to you. What are the demographic trends? What are community preference trends? What are the types of things people want to see in their community? How might that change over time? What's our school population look like? What's it going to look like 5 years from now? What are the trends that might impact that up or down or one way or another? And try and figure out, well, what are the things that we can do today that put us, what are the low risk solutions, right, that we would need to take regardless of the future scenario? What are the decisions we can make today that put us on a better path towards our desired scenario? What are the decisions we can make that mitigate the risk of an undesired scenario that's possible, but we want to minimize the potential for? Sustainability and resilience guide so much of what I do, and I want to maybe frame this a little bit differently than you typically hear. Of course, sustainability is around minimizing climate risk. It's about minimizing resource utilization. It's about minimizing our footprint on the earth. But it's also about making sure that the community can sustain itself over time. It's about understanding what the needs are going to be fiscally, certainly, over time, and how best we can create resilience for that. There's a great movement called Strong Towns that looks at the ways in which different property types and different development types create resilience in a municipal budget over time. So often we look at the individual tax bill of a property instead of the amount that it generates per acre or the amount of employment that it generates per acre, and work to try and find sustainability fiscally over time. Resilience, I spent many years helping reduce coastal flood risk around Connecticut. And that is a huge part of our resilience, about adapting to the changes that we will see with climate change. But resilience is also about building typology. I always use the example of, a big box retailer can really kind of only be one thing, like a warehouse for goods. Some places have turned them into churches or universities, and there's little bits that you can do here and there. But there are other building types, and I'm not by any means suggesting that this is a proxy for Westport, but if you look at neighborhoods like Soho in New York City, a single building that served as a manufacturing hub, then evolved into artist lofts, then evolved into high-end housing, then evolved into tech offices. That same building can evolve over time, which has meant that that neighborhood is incredibly resilient because it is more open to change and more adaptable regardless of what the future holds. I know walkability is something that's crucially important to you all here, and I've seen it kind of amplified in past initiatives. Everything to me in urban design comes down to walkability. And for anyone who says, well, you know, I may not walk, or you know, that's not the lifestyle that I'm looking for, I remind you, every single trip is at one point a walking trip. If you're driving to the mall or the shopping center, you ultimately get out of your car and walk into the store. If you're taking the train to the city, you ultimately walk up to the train platform. Pedestrian access is a component of every single trip, and making our places more walkable will accommodate every one of those. But I think importantly, as we think about traffic and congestion, and I know this is a big problem throughout, you know, Fairfield County, making sure that walkability and bikeability is an option for those for whom it makes sense. Typically, folks within a quarter mile or a half mile of their destination means that some of those trips will be taken by walking. Some of those trips will be taken by biking. With better transit, and I know there's some new flexible, adaptive modes of transit here now in Westport, some of those trips will be taken by walking, by transit, and those are trips that won't be taken by car and reduce the congestion that occurs on the roadways. Which brings me to a point about infrastructure. Just as I mentioned about sort of broadly environmental determinism, you know, I think about development as sort of infrastructure determinism, right? You are going to be constrained by different infrastructure within your community, whether it's electricity access, gas, clean water for drinking, wastewater treatment capacity, road capacity, train capacity, right? All of that will influence how much and where you can build. And it is crucial to understand that capacity as the kind of mold within which development can live. And then you can figure out whether or not there are points of acupuncture and intervention that can unlock some additional capacity that would enable incremental additional growth. But understanding that relationship between the two is crucially important. Which brings me to a final point, and again, please don't read into this image as being proposed as representative of Westport in its scale. This is Grand Central, if you could recognize it in Manhattan with One Vanderbilt. And I use this image just because I think it tells a story well about the relationship between private development and a community's objectives. Every municipality and community that I work with, I always make the same point that if you're viewing the development or developer as some other, then you're approaching the whole scenario the wrong way. When we develop a plan for our communities, and every municipality in Connecticut has to do a plan of conservation and development, and then we often do neighborhood plans or transit area plans or any number of other types of plans, those plans get implemented through investment. And that investment happens in two forms. First, it's our public investment, typically in infrastructure, governed by our capital plan. And then, of far greater magnitude, is the private investment that implements our plan through development. And that is governed by zoning and land use regulations. And so the whole trick of managing development is to figure out how to harness it through regulations to achieve your objectives as a community. And every community has a list of wants and needs. Back to the infrastructure point, maybe there are certain needs that you have, like the need to replace a bridge, or the need to upgrade a sewer plant, or the need to build a new school. And then there's going to be a list of wants, like waterfront access, or new parkland, or affordable housing probably falls more in the need category, but there's going to be a whole list of things. Figuring out how much you can leverage development to help you achieve those, either through direct subsidy by, say, requiring a waterfront walkway as a part of a development if it happens to be on a body of water, or through mechanisms like tax increment financing, how you can leverage the value of that future development to achieve community goals. And I always tell folks, you're gonna have a list of 20 things Development can probably only cover the first few of those. And maybe in a community like Westport, which has incredibly high value, maybe you can go a little bit further down the list. But the trick is figuring out where that balance point is, how much of that list you want delivered by private investment instead of public direct investment in infrastructure, and how much development you're willing to accommodate to offset that private investment in your community goals. And I find when we approach things that way, now we're thinking through about how to harness development to achieve our community objectives rather than battling development, which is trying to achieve something that is viewed as distinct from community goals. So just one example of where this has worked close to home for you all. As I said, I've worked in dozens and dozens of municipalities, large and small. This is from next door in Fairfield. This is around the Fairfield Black Rock train station, which at the time was under construction. I was hired by the town to manage a planning process around what at the time was a proposed train station. And ultimately, we went through a approximately 15-month process. We had meetings monthly. As I said, we had a curated kind of group of folks that were representative of various constituencies who didn't always come with the same objectives, but ultimately had to work through those together in a collaborative setting, which ended up with a unanimous approval of a plan amendment by the Plan Commission and a unanimous rezoning by the Zoning Commission. You know, the type of development that they allowed, I'm not suggesting at all is the type of development that you would want to see in Westport, but it was the type of development that was calibrated for them to achieve their community goals in this part of their town. A couple points that I would make. One is by upfronting that discussion outside of the context of any individual project, it allowed for a more holistic conversation that ultimately has resulted in a lack of consternation, if that makes any sense, around individual projects, right? Because we upfronted the debate. The debate was held around principles. The debate was held around outcomes. The debate was held around objectives rather than individual development projects, which now can go forward because they are implementing the vision and the structure that was laid out at that time. A couple things, though, about the kind of back to the importance of the participatory process. You know, the main lessons that I've learned from doing these, you know, in addition to what I said earlier about kind of making sure the right folks are in the room, providing mechanisms to make sure that folks can get there and be present, what I've learned is, you know, providing that iterative feedback loop throughout the process is incredibly important. Coming to the table first saying, we've reviewed all the prior plans. This is what you've all said before. Are those still valid? Do they need to be revisited? Should we start with that at the foundation, or are we starting someplace different? Coming back to each meeting and saying, here's the ideas you came up with last time. Here's the ones that we've incorporated. Here's the ones that we haven't. Here's the reasons why we haven't, because in the interim, we've identified them to be technically infeasible. Constantly demonstrating that we're hearing what people are saying and that we're moving forward incrementally based on shared consensus around the next steps. Ultimately, in this location, they implemented their first inclusionary zoning policy. So now every development that's built brings with it privately funded affordable housing. It included pedestrian improvements like a new pedestrian bridge over Ash Creek, new sidewalks and other amenities, again, all designed to evolve this, what was kind of an industrial kind of backwater into a new neighborhood center for the town, which has been incredibly valuable in terms of tax revenue, and it hasn't created significant negative externalities. So, finally, how does the Municipal Development Authority play into this, and what exactly are we? So as I said, we're a quasi-public authority. We were created by legislation in 2019, but we were not funded until 2023, and we didn't launch operations until 2024. So we're just about a year and a half old. I started August 1st, 2024. I'm the first executive director, and I was the only employee for the first year. We're now staffing up and engaging with our member communities in a meaningful way. We were set up to be a broad toolkit that could be mobilized in support of municipal action. And so we can provide technical assistance and planning support and engineering studies. We can provide infrastructure funding. We can provide development financing to private developers, the mix of which is totally dependent on what our partner municipality asks of us. In some municipalities, they have a plan in place, they have the zoning in place, the infrastructure's there, but the development doesn't pencil out, so we provide gap financing. In other communities, they have a strategy, but they need that public infrastructure to unlock the potential of their part of town that they want to see developed. And we can provide that infrastructure support. In other communities, they say, we think we want to develop out this town center or the area around this train station, but we need technical support and we need a venue to have that dialogue with our community to figure out what the first step is or where we are ultimately headed. And we can provide that too. We have a $90 million capital authorization for the next 2 fiscal years that can be given to communities either as grants for planning or infrastructure with local match or as loans to private developers. The way that we operate is by a community opting in. We can't work any place where we're not invited in. We are not foisting any vision upon our member municipalities, and we don't have any authority to make local decisions. The question I always get is, well, what are we giving up? You know, what is the state coming in to control? Nothing. We can't overrule zoning, we can't overrule planning, we can't force anything on you. We are a tool of technical assistance and financial resources.
What's entailed in opting in?
Yep.
From our standpoint.
Yep, so it's a multi-step process, the first of which is the local legislative body, so in Westport, the RTM, passes a resolution to join us. There's no obligation at that point. There's no commitment at that point. It is merely raising their hand to say, we want to have a formal discussion with you. And the importance of that is there's 169 municipalities in the state of Connecticut. We are allowed to partner with 167 of them, all except for Hartford or East Hartford. We can work in communities that have a downtown or a train station. So maybe that narrows the list to about 100, but we can't run around working with 100 communities. We want to work with those that have interest. And so that raising of the hand is the sign that says, okay, we can start rolling up our sleeves. We can start spending some time and energy with this community because they want to head down this path with us. Once a community opts in, and I should,
is there any commitment on our behalf, I guess is the question.
No, not at that initial stage. That initial stage is just an indication of interest, right? It is a raising of the hand to say, David, CMDA, we're worth you spending some time with because we want to have this conversation in a formal way. Once you opt in, the main thing that we do is we look at your zoning, and we have a statutory obligation to review your zoning, but only in the areas of town where you direct us, and it can only be within a half a mile of a rail station or downtown. So to be overly simplistic, in Westport, we could theoretically look at 3 places. We could look at a half a mile around the Westport station in Saugatuck. We could look at a half a mile around Greens Farm station, and we could look at the area around downtown. But we don't have to look at all 3 of those. We would look at whichever of those the town asks us to. When we look at that zoning, our statutory requirement is to certify whether or not your zoning in that area is likely to increase housing opportunity. To be clear, it's the actual statutory language is likely to substantially increase housing. I tell every community I talk to, don't get hung up on the word substantial. Substantial, if you're allowing any multifamily in a community like Westport that's predominantly single family, it's gonna be substantial. The important word is likely. Does the zoning work? Can a developer come in and say, I see the community's vision, it's articulated in zoning, we can make this work and we will implement that through our investment? Your zoning may check that box already. We haven't looked at it, we don't do that until after you opt in. If it doesn't, we may make recommendations and we would say, hey, we think your zoning should do X, Y, or Z in order to make it work better. At that point, it's up to the zoning commission whether or not to take those recommendations. We can't force it, we can't mandate it, we don't usurp any local control.
And I'm just going to incorporate some of these questions. And one is, if we invite you, who do you report to?
Yeah.
Who controls the process and owns the results?
Yeah, great question. So I work for a board, and that board is established through legislation. It's a 16-member board, and it includes bipartisan appointees of the executive and the legislative branch. And so 7 of my board members are commissioners in the governor's cabinet. 3 of my board members are appointees of the governor, and then there's appointees of legislative leadership. The Speaker of the House, the Majority Leader, the Minority Leader, the President of the Senate, the Majority Leader, and the Minority Leader. And those folks, those representatives are from all over the state. They work for housing organizations, they work for municipalities, they work for councils of government, and all of our meetings are public. We're subject to FOIA, right? We're just like a state agency in that regard. And the process plays out in the public forum. And so when we go through that zoning analysis, it's discussed at our board, it's discussed with the municipality, and once it's certified, we move on to the final step, which is the execution of a memorandum of agreement with the chief executive official or officer of the municipality to establish the boundaries of the development district. And so the development district can only be within a downtown or within a half a mile of a train station, and it can only cover the area that has zoning that we've certified. So for example, there are communities that we work with. You draw a half a mile around the train station, that covers about 500 acres is a half a mile radius. And maybe 400 of those acres are single family neighborhoods that are zoned for single family, but maybe 100 of those acres are zoned for different types of multifamily housing or mixed use development. Our development district would only be the 100 acres that the community has zoned for transit-oriented village or downtown infill. It would not cover the single-family neighborhoods that are zoned for single-family. And so where we are today, and then I will open it up more broadly today for questions, 27 municipalities, have opted in. They've taken that first step. And you'll see it's communities of all different types all over the state. Some of them have a train station, some have a bus rapid transit station, others just have a walkable and mixed use downtown. Obviously, it includes the big cities, Bridgeport and Waterbury and New Haven. But I think there's maybe communities up there that would surprise you. Old Saybrook, Guilford, Avon, Fairfield. And I think what we've found is people really welcome this approach where it's collaborative. We don't have a one-size-fits-all solution. We don't have a mandate that we put on municipalities. We don't usurp any local control, but rather we bring a diverse set of tools that a municipality may not have available to them on their own, to help them achieve their vision. And so as you see there, 27 municipalities have opted in. About 7 or 8 have had their zoning certified, and 2 have moved on to the establishment of a development district, Saugatuck and Derby. And we expect, I have a board meeting immediately after this at 1 o'clock today, and we expect that there'll be another 5 or 6 who have their development district established today.
Did you have a question, Kristen? No, my colleague. colleagues. All right. How will the CMDA be different from is it CRDA?
Yeah, great question. So the CRDA is the Capital Region Development Authority, which is a financing quasi-public authority established to support housing development in Hartford and East Hartford. That's why Hartford and East Hartford cannot work with us. We are basically CRDA for the rest of the state, but with a little bit of a broader purview related to kind of strategic planning, economic development, and infrastructure.
How do you feel about the desirability and efficacy of public-private partnerships?
Yeah, great question. So I think I almost want to say they're essential. Everything, I think, as perhaps you kind of gleaned from my discussion around sort of the Grand Central example, and I guess I should have put a finer point on that. One Vanderbilt built the expansion of Grand Central. And so if you've been to the new Grand Central and the tunnel that connects down to Long Island Railroad and the broader kind of area of the Lexington Avenue subway station, right, that was all built by One Vanderbilt as an exchange for the amount of development that they were allowed to get. So I think, I view kind of everything as a public-private partnership. Again, if you view development as the private investment in helping the community implement its plan, every development that takes place here is a public-private partnership. It could be as arm's length as governing it through zoning, or it can be far more direct in a more integral partnership. But I think kind of that whole spectrum and everything that we see is some level of public-private partnership.
Okay, and regarding funding, what is the source of your funds? Do communities pay interest to CMDA or to the state on funds received?
Yeah, good question. So our seed funding, the $90 million, is state bond funds. We do expect that will be continued over time, but it will also become revolving as we loan funds out. We'll get it back, essentially like an economic development bank. If funds are lent to a developer, they would absolutely repay it to us with interest. If funds are granted to a municipality, it is far more likely that there would be a local cost share, a 80-20 or a 70-30 split in the infrastructure rather than a loan. I think it would be very unlikely that the municipality would pay us interest. Rather, you would pay a share of the cost of the infrastructure project that we would invest in with you.
The communication process can break down quickly, and as may or may not have happened here, how do you help in that capacity? Between the town and a developer.
So we have a cadre of on-call consultants. We have 17 consultants on call that have a wide variety of expertise, from wastewater treatment to transportation planning to urban design to development finance, et cetera, et cetera. And we draw upon those consultants in support of our member municipalities. And so some communities have asked us to leverage our consultant expertise to help them assess their wastewater treatment capacity, others around pedestrian improvements. And if Westport were to become a member, Westport could request of us that we draw from that resource and provide some of our funding to help facilitate a community engagement process or do some of the technical analysis related to infrastructure capacity and the ways in which development could play out over time.
Okay, how do you weigh 830G, goals? And on that, is the goal of the CMDA to add more affordable housing to communities? If so, what is your goal in that regard?
Yeah, good question. So I've got 3 different answers for that question that are all kind of different parts of the same story. So first, we do not have an affordability requirement. There are many housing programs in the state of Connecticut that have different target users or different kind of development objectives. Our program is fairly unique in that we support production to better rationalize supply and demand. We do not say it has to be affordable or this much of it has to be affordable at this level. But if a municipality has an affordability requirement, we defer to your requirement. So that's one answer. A second answer around 830G specifically, listen, 830G is the stick. We are the carrot, right? We are the program designed very much in the governor's vision that communities that are trying to build housing in the places where it can contribute positively to the state's economy and increase supply, we are going to reward them with support, whether that's technical or financial. 830G is kind of the other side of the coin, and it exists. The third point I'll make also on 830G, many communities have asked me specifically about what our relationship would be with 830G projects. And I've said publicly many times, we will only fund projects if a developer reaches out to us and says, hey, I'm building around such and such a train station, I've borrowed this much money from a bank, I've put in this much equity, we still have a gap, can you fill that gap? We will only entertain that if that project has gone through local zoning. And so I would tell every community, we wouldn't fund an 830G project. We are funding the projects that realize your municipal vision. Now that said, one community has asked us, they happen to have engaged in a friendly 830G with a developer, and they've said, we'd like for this project to be eligible for your funding support, right? So we could, but it would be totally at the municipality's discretion. We would never come in and fund a project that bypassed your local regulatory process.
This may be, you may have just answered that, but if you find zoning change is substantially likely to increase affordable housing, does it give ammunition to 830G development in court cases? That's a complicated one.
Yeah, that's a tricky question, and I don't want to get specific about it, but I would say, you know, yeah, I'm not even sure exactly how to answer it, other than to say there's nothing that we would do that I think would have any bearing. The 830G process is so dependent on your zoning and your process and your zoning commission's actions. There's nothing that we could do that would influence that. Yeah.
Fair. How much of your focus is on housing versus economic development?
Yeah, great question. So our statutory purpose, you know, we have like 7 statutory purposes or 8 or 9. Number 1 is transit-oriented and economic development. Number 2 is housing. But I tell everyone the reason we exist, the reason we're funded, the reason why there's political impetus for us to support municipalities is largely because of the housing crisis. And so our early initiatives will be housing forward. I think it is highly unlikely that we would fund something that doesn't include a housing component in our first couple years, but we do have the statutory flexibility to engage in broader economic development as long as it is in a downtown and near a train station, or, near a train station.
This question is, if the half-mile radius includes state-owned property, how is change created?
Yeah, good question. So state property is always a little interesting, right? I think folks know they're subject to somewhat different rules and don't always have to go through zoning. But we wouldn't be able to play any role in any development of state property unless it's through the mechanism of our partnership with the member municipality. And so we at CMDA can't come in and say, oh, we're gonna support this development that the state is doing on their property if it's outside of the conditions of our relationship as embodied in the MOA.
Can we use your services if we don't want to establish a development district?
No.
Okay. I appreciate short but sweet. How do you work with the town with virtually no developable I'm not sure that's a word, but no land that can be developed. How do you find land for development and housing?
Sure. So there's always land that can be developed. I mean, there's surface parking lots, there's underutilized commercial property, there's vacant land. There's not a single place in the world that is fully developed. It can always be redeveloped. But again, it would be governed by your plan, your vision, and your regulations. But we would help figure that out. I mean, I've worked in communities, I'll give an example, where there's a gas station on the 100% corner in the middle of the main street, and their primary objective is to see that become something better and something that fits in with the fabric of the community and the walkable neighborhoods, et cetera. And we do an analysis, and the community says, we absolutely want to see this converted into a 2-story building with retail and restaurants on the ground floor and office or apartments above. And we do the analysis and say, that's never going to happen at 2 stories, but maybe it'll happen at 4 stories. And that's a question for the community. Is the redevelopment of that site worth that type of redevelopment, or is that type of development less favorable than the existing conditions? Every site goes through a calculation like that. Again, New York City is the wrong, precedent for you all, but it's something I know you're all familiar with. They're about to tear down a 40-story hotel next to Grand Central because it's economically viable to replace it with a 100-story office tower, right? It can always be redeveloped. It just comes down to the economics and whether or not the objective of converting the existing conditions into something new is balanced out with what the community is willing to accept.
Great. David has a 1 o'clock meeting, and he wants to say hello to some people here. One quick one before we go. How do you obtain private funding? With whom do you work?
Yeah, so typically the developers that we support are coming with a primary lender already at the table, and then we're providing gap financing. But we are in conversations with quite a few regional and local banks who very much like the idea of our program and knowing that the government could be in alongside them with mezzanine debt. And so I think it's very possible that in the relatively near term, we would also be bringing banks to the discussion with developers to facilitate financing of projects.
Okay, I know some of the candidates for leadership are here and some of the RTM members. So David, Kooris, thanks so much for being here, and thank all of you for being here as well.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you both. As a wrap up, as David mentioned, the process requires the RTM to opt into this engagement with the CMDA. It does not obligate us in any way to participate. It is the opportunity to start a dialogue. If you think that is a good next step, I have a petition that I would love for you to sign that will allow us to move that to the next step. It's here, come find me. I'm happy to tell you even more about it. Sadly, David, as we've heard, has a meeting quickly, but do please come up, introduce yourselves. More importantly, please take a moment to thank Mr. Westport, David Briggs, and David Kooris for this excellent conversation.